Good afternoon. Welcome, and thank you for joining the Virginia Association of Wetland Professionals for our first spring webinar of 2021. I'm Laura Rader Dixon. I'm the current and outgoing president of VAWP. Now, normally, VAWP would be planning and promoting our traditionally in-person spring meeting, but this year we have decided to arrange several lunch-length webinars for each Wednesday in March. And of course, this is not like getting together and be able to network and gathering together, but we do hope to honor the VAWP mission of providing up-to-date information through these webinars. So in the next few weeks, besides the webinars, this information exchange, and hopefully a little bit of discussion, we will also be accepting nominations for key board positions, and we'll be holding elections on the last week of March and also during the business meeting on March 31st. We have a website committee headed up by Emily Foster, and they have established our new and improved webpage, virginiawetlands.org or vawetlands.org. So other than keeping an eye out for emails for this information, you can also check our webpage and be able to get more involved with VAWP. We have a mix of presentations, both regulatory and research, one of which is featuring a CNU student, which comes to mind that we do have, and this is right off of our webpage, our fantastic webpage, a scholarship tab, and we have a yearly scholarship that unfortunately went unclaimed last year, so we have doubled the scholarship amount for this year, and we are currently accepting applications. So if you know of any students that are in wetland studies, please encourage them to apply. We have also this membership tab right here. Any memberships that were paid in 2020, we are going to go ahead and carry those over to 2021. Thank you for sticking with us through this time. But if you are not a member, please consider joining. And there is the membership tab right there. One last bit of business. I would like to recognize the monumental effort that has occurred to put these webinars together. And we have some fantastic VAWP members, and they have miraculously assembled this in record time. And I really appreciate everything that they have done to put this together. And also, AECOM is hosting this event on their platform for this session, and we really appreciate their help. So, with all that out of the way, I'd like to introduce Becky Gwynn. She is the Assistant Chief of the Wildlife Division of the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources. She has worked for Virginia DWR for 34 years and most recently led efforts to relocate Virginia's largest seabird colony for the HRBT Islands to a place that was more suitable. She is also the staff lead for the draft regulations to establish the first in the country state permitting program of incidental take under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And so with that, I would like to pass this over to Becky. Becky, you're on mute, by the way.
My apologies. Thank you again for giving me the opportunity to talk with you today about something that's actually the first in the country, and that is a state level effort to permit the incidental take of migratory birds. And some of you may be thinking, isn't that a function of the federal government and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service? Well, let me tell you a little bit of the story that brought us to this point here in Virginia. You may be aware of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. This is a 100-year-old legislation that is intended to protect migratory birds from direct and indirect take, not only in the United States, but throughout North America And in fact, several other countries outside of the North American continent are signatories on this treaty. In its interpretation and previous practice, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service did actually address indirect take of migratory birds with some particular projects, not all, and there didn't seem to be a very consistent process by which that happened. And in December of 2017, the Department of the Interior Solicitor issued an opinion in which he said that the Migratory Bird Treaty Act does not, in fact, allow the federal government to regulate the incidental take of birds. So many states have bird conservation and protection laws and regulations that have a direct connection back to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and that left all of us in a position of having no mechanism to allow or otherwise facilitate any kind of incidental take. In Virginia, our laws are actually very prescriptive, very restrictive when it comes to impacting wildlife without authorization or laws or regulations that actually allow that. So in February of last year, Governor Northam actually issued a directive to the department for us to create regulations that would define and permit incidental take of migratory birds, really to create this policy backstop in the absence of something at the federal level. And it would apply to major commercial, industrial, and construction projects. So we have taken that effort to task and spent most of the last calendar year drafting those regulations. And we have brought in and included some stakeholders, both from the conservation community and the potentially regulated community, to help shape and inform that as we've gone through that. So I'd like to share with you more information about the regulation itself and what we're intending to accomplish and what the permitting construct might look like. So as I've mentioned previously, the purpose of this regulation really is to manage the incidental take of migratory birds and their habitats by establishing this regulatory framework that outlines the administration, implementation, and enforcement of an incidental take permitting program. I think it's important to recognize that the Department of Wildlife Resources has not been in the environmental permitting arena previously. We do have a lot of regulatory authorities and responsibilities, but the environmental permitting aspect of this is new to us as it is new to the conservation and regulated communities. But our goal here is to really provide protections to migratory birds and habitats by the implementation of best practices that really avoid and minimize and mitigate the incidental take of birds when they're in Virginia. So the scope of the regulation is broad. It includes all migratory bird species, eggs, and active nests. I think it's important to recognize that it does not include threatened and endangered bird species. There is separate Virginia law in the Virginia Endangered Species Act that provides the framework for the Board of Wildlife Resources to individually, separately permit the incidental take of threatened and endangered species. And because there are species that are non-migratory, like quail and wild turkey, those species would not be covered under this permitting framework either. The application is statewide, so we will be building the derivative plans that I'll be talking about to address statewide activities, and it will be applicable to habitats characterized as significant avian habitats or general avian habitats of biological significance. And I'll talk a little bit more about those here in just a minute. Some key definitions, like any good regulation, our particular regulation starts off with a number of definitions to ensure that there is clarity and certainty about what we are speaking of. And I've already mentioned this concept of biologically significant avian habitats. and those play a key factor in decisions about whether or not general permits will suffice or individual incidental take permits will be necessary for particular projects. And those habitats that are biologically significant are ones that are public or private conservation lands and waters designated as biologically important, or lands and waters that encompass unique features that are important to birds. So we're not necessarily talking about the entire landscape of Virginia as a primary focus, but those that have some specific conservation value or biological importance to birds generally. If you're not familiar with the concept of incidental take, it's important to recognize that that is different from direct take, where you are intentionally going out to do something with a bird. Incidental take is a take that is the result of, but not the direct purpose of, an activity. And an example of that might be burning up of a nest as the result of a prescribed fire, the intent of which was to affect habitat management in a particular area, as an example. The prescribed fire intent was not directly to take a bird nest, as an example. I'll also be talking about sector-specific plans as I go through this presentation today. And just to help shape the context for that, a sector-specific plan is a framework that defines activities that will require a permit and the criteria for obtaining a permit. And by sectors, we mean various categories of activities that will fall under the regulatory framework of this permitting program. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, the definition that we have defined for this regulation of take includes many of the key characteristics that you will find in definitions of take elsewhere in environmental laws and regulations, such as harm, harass, kill, destroy. We have expanded our definition in this regulation to include disturb, or activities that will significantly or permanently impede normal avian behaviors, obstruct the use or destroy or degrade habitats, or reduce reproductive success of bird species in Virginia. So keep those in mind as we go through the rest of this framework and how our approach is laid out in the proposed regulation. So as I mentioned, when we talk about this particular plan, we are not talking about covering every sector that of activities that could occur across the Commonwealth. The regulated activities that we have proposed to be covered under sector-specific plans adopted by the board include these 8 commercial activities, industrial activities, oil, gas, wastewater disposal pits, methane and other gas burner pipes, communication towers, electric transmission and distribution lines, wind and solar energy projects, and transportation projects, because those activities are the ones for which the data really strongly exist to support incidental take occurring as a result of these activities. So by extension, if an activity is not included on this list, it is by default exempted from being covered under this particular permitting program. So we will be developing these sector-specific plans. Importantly, the regulation that our board is considering right now is simply the framework, and we'll talk a little bit more about what's in that framework here as we go through. But the real conservation value of this particular program is achieved in these sector-specific plans that will be developed should the Board of Wildlife Resources choose to adopt this regulation at its next meeting later this month. As you saw with the sectors, there are, I think, 9 of them, and they range in complexity and the extent of activities that could be covered under them. So we intend to do these sector-specific plans in a phased approach. Some will certainly be less complex and take less time to develop than others will, such as the industrial and commercial and transportation categories. So it's important to recognize that no permits are needed for a particular sector until its plan has been developed and adopted by the Board of Wildlife Resources. So the adoption of this framework doesn't in and of itself compel any of the sectors to immediately start seeking approval for a permit. And until a plan is completed, that's the activities under that sector do not need to be covered. Even when a sector-specific plan is adopted, a project won't require a permit if it meets one of these criteria. If it's already under active construction, if it has all of the necessary permits in place, but construction hasn't started, or if the a potential applicant can prove that the project has significant contractual obligations already in place and they are working through permitting with other regulators as well. So not every project at the moment of adoption will need to be covered under a permit anyway. So it's important to make sure that there's that certainty for the potentially regulated constituencies. Sector plans will also include thresholds for inclusion or exclusion. So for instance, as we move into the communication tower sector-specific plan as an example, I would anticipate that plan to indicate that towers under a certain size or over a certain size would be included or excluded as examples. There may be scales with regard to acreage or extent of development that will help us frame within a specific sector in more detail what would be required to apply for a permit and what will be excluded right from the beginning. Sector-specific plans may have different best practices or requirements for specific species or geographies across Virginia. So the impacts of a particular sector's activities may be different in coastal Virginia than it will be in the mountains, or it may be different for shorebirds than it would be for raptors. And so we want to be sure to define and refine those specific needs across the Commonwealth so that we don't necessarily obligate a project to provide best practices for species that may not even occur in the area of the project. I mentioned previously exemptions. Well, by extension, if you're not on the list, then you're by default exempted. We did decide to add some specific clarification and exempting agricultural and silvicultural activities explicitly, as well as residential development activities. And certainly any of the regulated activities that would fall under one of those 9 categories, if they were being performed under emergency situations like restoring human health or addressing public safety issues, as an example. So similar to other environmental permitting in Virginia, our approach to this process would be that in each sector-specific plan, we would outline the frameworks for a general permit and an individual permit. And under the general permits, we anticipate outlining best management practices to be employed that would first avoid and then minimize the incidental take of birds by those particular projects. We envision this to be a straightforward application process with relatively limited staff review on DWR's side of this process. By their very nature are going to be for more complex projects or those projects that are unable for some reason to implement the best practices that would enable it to apply for a general permit. It's fair to say that these individual projects will require more staff review and engagement and discussion between the permit applicant and the DWR. The terms for our permits at this point, we anticipate a general permit not to exceed 8 years, an individual permit not to exceed 10 years. As we work through the specific sector plan development, we've already heard from the specific organizations representing some of these specific sectors that our timeframes may be overly generous for some of these, and that we may be able in some of the sector specific plans to define a permit term that is less than these maximums defined in the overall framework. At this time, the intent of the department and the Board of Wildlife Resources is that our incidental take permitting framework and the sector specific plans will really focus on construction phases of project development and the opportunities to influence longer term operations as part of construction, but it does leave the door open for the board to consider permitting operations longer term in any of the sector specific plans. As an example, where we have received feedback on the desire for more defined permitting frameworks for operations would be, for instance, in the wind energy category, where there is evidence that long-term operations of wind towers does present challenges and results in incidental take of migratory birds. But at this time, the intent really is to focus on construction phases of projects. An individual incidental take permit application will be required to include an avian conservation and mitigation plan, where more project-specific details will be outlined and describing the likely and anticipated impacts on migratory birds, what the applicant's proposed efforts to mitigate the incidental take are, what alternatives the applicant has considered and rejected, and what contingency planning the applicant is anticipating putting into place should the proposed activities to mitigate impacts to migratory birds fail as the project is under development. And this would certainly be one of those areas where we would anticipate a fairly significant exchange and discussion between our department, subject matter experts, and the permit applicant, and the applicant's supporting staff and consultants. I've mentioned that an aspect of this does include mitigation, and certainly our intent under the general permits would be to establish best practices and other tools that would allow a permittee to, would enable a permittee rather, to avoid and minimize the incidental take of migratory birds. But we recognize that there are instances where incidental take is unavoidable, and in that case, then we will be outlining what compensation would look like to respond to that. We intend that the mitigation really is using best practical and necessary technologies to meet the plan requirements, and our goal is that compensation achieves a no net loss of regulated birds and habitats. At this time, we don't have a detailed framework of what mitigation might look like, whether compensation would include in lieu fee or other kinds of industry standard compensation tools. We will be establishing that through a separate regulatory framework to be developed subsequent to a board decision to adopt this proposed regulation at its meeting later this month. Like any good regulatory permitting, any good permitting regulation, there is a significant amount of narrative dedicated to the administrative processes related to this permitting framework. The regulation language does outline the approach for an applicant to request and obtain a permit. It includes the mechanisms that would allow for modification, transfer, renewal, and termination, early termination of permits. It describes the permit fee, which by statute is currently capped for the Department of Wildlife Resources. And it also includes processes for project inspection, permit suspension, permit revocation, and enforcement, enforcement of the regulation and permit terms and conditions. Importantly, the permit regulation does include an administrative dispute resolution and appeals process. That is a non-regulatory document that we have developed that is incorporated into the regulation by reference. It establishes informal fact-finding panels for a variety of reasons and purposes, everything from a permit denial to permit revocation, suspension and revocation. It also outlines a framework for a formal hearing process that follows the Virginia Administrative Processes Act process. And it outlines the mechanism and opportunity for the applicant and permittee to develop and submit and follow a corrective action plan related to a particular permitting action. As I mentioned, we have been working with, in collaboration with stakeholders, both from the conservation community and the potentially regulated community. The stakeholder working group has been comprised of 16 representatives from industry and from conservation interests. We use that group to provide input on a range of topics after we had spent some significant time developing the initial language for the regulation. We did put out a discussion draft of this regulation in March of last year and solicited comments, and we did receive a number of comments from all interested parties. Our stakeholder working group has had 3 meetings to date, the most recent being actually on. We did conduct a 45-day public comment period that was the result of our board proposing to actually taking action to propose this regulation at its meeting in December. That public comment period began in early January and lasted through the middle of February. And we received just over 700 comments through a variety of means that we've made available for individuals to provide comment. We have an online comment portal. People were able to email comments to the department. We have a specific regulatory email address set up for that. And we did quite a bit to try to promote this and create public awareness about this through a variety of platforms, including press releases and our obligatory legal advertisement and newspaper, but also using our social media platforms and e-newsletters that we develop and distribute as an agency on a regular basis. So we got a lot of attention on this particular proposed regulation and felt like we received some really valuable and meaningful feedback from a variety of interests on this topic. So our next steps really are to finalize consideration of these public comments. We've been going through the 21 to 22, more significant comments that we received from both the conservation community and the regulated communities, and are looking at how we integrate those comments into a final updated regulation to present back to the board later this month. They will be meeting on the 18th to take final action on this regulation. If they elect to adopt it as a final later this month, we have a proposed effective date of July 1 of this year. And again, the effective date in placing this regulation as effective really changes nothing about how we accomplish work here in Virginia. It simply enables the framework that then allows us to start working on those specific sector-specific plans. And subsequent to, should the board elect to adopt it, and we have our July 1 effective date, then at the staff level, we would begin the development of a timeline and sequencing for those sector-specific plans and the mitigation framework that I mentioned earlier, so that we could begin notifying representatives from those various sectors and identifying and establishing some stakeholder working groups that would be thematically focused on those particular sectors. So that's all I have to present this afternoon, and I'm happy to take questions at this point. I realize permitting is not very glamorous, but certainly has an important conservation role in Virginia, and is something that we want to make sure that we have created as much certainty both for the environmental community and for the regulated communities to understand what our intent and ultimate desired outcomes are. So thank you very much. I appreciate that.
And Becky, listeners. For our listeners, there is a Q&A component. It's on the right. We will not be able to open microphones, but you're welcome to write in your questions. And Becky, to start us off, and then Laura and Eli will be alternating reading questions out loud that we receive. I believe that we've got some questions starting to come in, but for the first question, how would one determine whether or not birds on site are migratory and covered under this regulation? And I've left you muted.
Sorry about that. So we have developed a list of migratory birds. They in fact come from the federal list of migratory birds and would be ones that we have documented in Virginia. So importantly, there are birds that are classified as migratory that are actually residents in Virginia. So we're not simply looking at birds that are in Virginia only at a certain time of the year, but all of the species that have been declared at the federal level to be classified as migratory birds, because the species as a whole is migratory, even though we have some resident populations in Virginia.
Thank you, Becky. We have a question from Ron Lanham from VTCA. For industry segments that are currently regulated by a dedicated state agency, can or will this permit be administered by that agency? And this is specifically the mining industry in Virginia.
You know what, that's a great question. And I actually spent some time on the phone with representatives from the Virginia Oil and Gas Association within the last 2 weeks, and was asked that same question, whether there could be an opportunity for an agreement between the Department of Wildlife Resources and the Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy. And I absolutely think that's worth exploring as we get to a particular sector that may have a nexus with another state agency. You know, certainly we will reach out to those other state agencies and determine whether or not there's opportunity to collaborate with them to administer this aspect of Virginia's conservation permitting programs through their existing permitting processes. I don't have a definitive answer, but that's certainly something we're willing to explore and consider and figure out if there are options available to us.
Thanks, Becky. We have another question related to the sector-specific plans and if there's been any consideration given to how the approach will go into which industries or which sectors will be, the plan will be developed first. if there's going to be a prioritization of the different sectors, and about how long the timeline will be to develop those plans might be.
Yeah. Great questions. We ask those of ourselves all of the time. I think if you look at the list of sectors that we have identified for inclusion under this framework, there are certainly some communication towers and electric distribution and transmission lines being two really notable examples from my perspective, where there has been significant work done between industry and the conservation communities to identify and implement those best practices that go a long way to reducing the incidental take of migratory birds. From our very preliminary perspective, those might be two, for instance, that we would take first in the queue, because I think the scope and complexity may be less. The availability of mutually agreed upon best practices is likely more clear than for some of the other sectors. When we talk about the commercial, industrial, and transportation sectors, I think that there is the high likelihood that those will be much more complex. There may be fewer best practices that have been identified and considered by the conservation and industry, by the conservation community and industry. And so while we haven't finalized that, those are just some thoughts off the top of my head that following a decision by the Board of Wildlife Resources to adopt this later this month, then we would certainly start looking at that and make that information available again as we start reaching out to entities that could potentially be interested in participating in our stakeholder working groups.
Thank you. We do have another question on, can you elaborate on general avian habitat of biological significance? Is there a functional assessment framework that will be developed to determine general avian habitat?
So I apologize for not looking at the screen because I'm looking at my draft regulation to make sure that I am providing you with the definition that we have drafted for that. Lands and waters that are not classified as biologically significant avian habitat, but require evaluation using methods developed by the department to determine biological value to regulated bird species. And I have an example of that might be, for those of you who are aware of the Hampton Roads Bridge-Tunnel, one of the two anchoring artificial islands has become, over the last 3 decades, home to Virginia's largest seabird colony. In no definition that I can think of would any of us consider that to be biologically significant avian habitat, but from the perspective of that seabird colony, it is indeed a very meaningful, important, valuable habitat to that colony. And so we will be doing our due diligence should the board adopt this regulation to further characterize and define the biologically significant avian habitat. There's a very long definition in the proposed regulation, and to put more parameters and clarity around general avian habitats as well.
Great. We got a couple questions on if there's been any talk of timelines associated with either permit review or issuance, and how that might factor into the regulations.
So yes, there has been, and as I mentioned, the draft regulation or the proposed regulation itself, which I'm happy to actually send to a member of the organization leadership if you'd like to distribute that to the folks participating in the webinar today, but we have identified, and I'm reluctant to read it all out because it includes everything from determinations of completeness to actual review. We have identified a time frame in which once an application is determined to be complete and a sector-specific plan requires additional review, that we can take no more than 120 days to review a permit application and make a finding. There are additional timeframes identified in the regulation with regard to exchanges regarding completeness of an application, what happens if an application is not approved with regard to revisions of applications, and a time frame for an applicant to appeal permit terms and conditions if they have question or concern about those. But I'm hopeful that in the development of sector-specific plans, we will have great certainty about permit terms and conditions for those general permits to the point where an applicant for a general permit in particular should have pretty solid clarity about what to expect as permit terms and conditions. I'm hopeful that answered the question, but I will say there's like 3 pages in this narrative that have to do with timelines associated with all aspects of the permitting process.
Thank you again. We have another question to clarify: if an activity does not fall into one of the sectors that will have permits developed, is it exempted from coverage under the permit program, or are they excluded from regulation by this completely? I believe the language used in the presentation was, quote, exempted from being covered under this program, unquote.
So so an interesting perspective that we've not really focused on in terms of the choice of words. If a sector is not explicitly identified as being covered, then it is, from my perspective as a biologist, excluded and exempted. There is no obligation for activities in a sector that is not one of those 8 or 9 topics to be concerned about requiring a permit. I will note that we had some requests in our public comment to expand the list of included sectors, and we will always be evaluating and considering the impacts a specific sector has on migratory birds, and whether or not at some point in the future additional sectors need to be added for coverage under a sector-specific plan. But that's not something that the 8 or 9 sectors we've included now are those that the preponderance of data really support have significant impacts from an incidental take perspective, and the others do not. So we are, if they're not included, then there's no need or obligation to pursue or consider a permit.
Great. Someone else has asked if you might be able to explain what some of the best practices might look like specifically for the renewable energy industries, such as solar and wind, and how those best practices might end up looking for cohabitation of those projects and birds.
I don't have anything specific. One example that I can bring to mind, because we've sort of fleshed out for our own informational purposes a concept for the communication tower best practice. And an example there might be, for instance, most of these towers require some form of lighting on them, and particular kinds of lighting are better for birds than others. And so our best practice might include the use of certain kinds of lighting versus just lighting in general. But that's the whole purpose of having stakeholder working groups, helping us really evaluate and consider all of the best practices that are currently known or implemented for these particular sectors. Many of them are voluntary, some of them are regulatory in nature, and we would be looking to bring the best of those into these sector-specific plans.
Thank you. We have another question. This regulation would be in addition to, not in place of, the provisions of the MBTA, and a regulated entity would have to comply with both, correct? Question mark.
There has been quite a bit of activity at the federal level within the last few months that some really interesting challenges from the perspective of this proposed regulation. In January, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service did publish a final rule effectively codifying that M opinion of the solicitor that I mentioned previously, which was that the MBTA does not cover the incidental take of migratory birds. That is what led us to this place to begin with. Subsequent to that, with the change of administration, there has been a delay in the implementation of that final rule. And in fact, the Fish and Wildlife Service is soliciting additional public comment about the final rule itself. I believe those comments were due by this past Monday. It's unclear to us what actions the federal government might take to either continue adoption of, to unwind the recent federal rules, and in what time frame that might occur. And we've heard everything from it's an easy fix from their perspective to it could be complicated and require an entirely separate and new rulemaking process. In addition, from our perspective, the going back to what was in place prior to the M opinions issuance in 2017 still doesn't provide great certainty for either the conservation community or the potentially regulated community. There were no rules related to what projects, in what time frame, and what might trigger the Fish and Wildlife Service to actually review and consider the need or issuance of an incidental take permit. So we do not intend to run a process that is entirely duplicative of a federal process, but at this point we are unclear about when the federal government will get to a point where it has an incidental take permitting tool in place that we feel is sufficiently supportive of migratory birds in Virginia. Should we get to that point, we absolutely will be the first in line to go back to our board of directors to say that the federal system that has been put in place negates and makes our permitting program redundant, and request a board consideration for revocation of those regulations. But until such time, we are going to continue forward with our program in Virginia.
So moving from the federal to talk about state, I'm going to try to combine a couple questions here. It seems like that this regulation it's going to be particularly applicable to a wide range of habitats across the state, and that there might be a lot of permitting needed associated with the proposed regulation. So the first question would be if you have a sense of how many applications you're planning to receive within the first year potentially for this. And then once applications begin to get processed, has there been discussion on how that is going to play in with interacting with other state agencies for their permitting processes, and if this will be done concurrently or if this will result in potential delays?
So I think the first question was how many applications do we envision receiving? To be honest, we do not have a sense at this time of how many applications we will receive. I think for any particular sector, as I mentioned, there will be some fairly significant determinations in that regard based on what we decide to be minimum thresholds. For instance, if a proposed project doesn't meet a minimum threshold, then it will not even need a permit, so no application would be needed. And as we define those thresholds, I think we will have greater clarity about what those permitting numbers might look like. With regard to the second question, which had to do with interactions with other environmental permitting processes in Virginia, as I mentioned, I think if there are opportunities to collaborate with the other state permitting agencies and integrate this process into their existing processes, we are absolutely willing to look at that. It will be important, though, in doing so, that we are still achieving through other regulatory permitting activities the conservation goals that we've identified for this particular program. So to the degree that we can get that support from the other regulating agencies, we can certainly work closely to align or integrate with their permitting activities.
Yeah, that's great. One of the personal questions I had on this was, is there any proposal for additional staffing for DWR in association with this program?
Well, so that's actually where the rubber really meets the road. This is not something, as I mentioned previously, that DWR, has not been a formal environmental permitting agency. So we have a small environmental staff. And I do know that our executive director has been in discussions with members of the General Assembly and members of the administration about the capacity of the department to be effective and efficient in administering this. And we are at the head of the line of people who do not want to implement a program that we do not have the capacity to administer. So at this point, I don't have an answer to that question, but I do know that our stakeholder groups have raised that question and indicated their support with the department in making the case for additional staffing to support this effort to ensure its effective implementation.
Somewhat related to that, within the significant habitat categories, would it be assumed that migratory birds are present or nesting during certain times of the year, or will nesting and other types of surveys be required in the permitting process?
I think that, at least as we've initially envisioned it, that the survey work would likely only be an aspect of an application for an individual incidental take permit, that we would by default make some assumptions with regard to presence of birds. And that's where I think that the discussion in the sector-specific plan development about geographies and species presence becomes an important one, because I think we can look to winnow the world of possibility, if you will, with regard to best practices that would need to be applied in certain parts of the state based on the presence or absence generally of certain kinds of species.
We've had one person who's dug into the regulation, the draft regulation a little bit, and had a specific question in part H 3.H. It talks about inspections. It mentions that emergency inspections can occur when the department deems it necessary. Do you know what an emergency situation might mean? Is it would potentially be a result of a public complaint, or in what situations?
Yes, it could be. I mean, that would be a great example, a public complaint or awareness through some other regulatory entity of a bird kill, for instance, that was reported through other means, would be the kinds of things that we're thinking about that constitute that emergency investigation.
I believe our last question has to do with VDOT. Have you started a process with VDOT and determined if there's a scale of road that will be programmatically excluded or included?
has been a partner with us in this process from the beginning. They commented on our discussion document, and they have been a very engaged and involved member of our stakeholder working group. And I know that that question and many related to that are the types of things that we look forward to talking about when we get to the transportation sector specific plan. That is exactly the kind of thing that I could see establishing thresholds for. We don't want to permit the new left turn lane, but we certainly want to consider, a brand new interstate, for instance. And so establishing those thresholds in a meaningful way so that we achieve conservation benefit to birds, but also don't unduly burden the transportation, planning, and construction industry is going to be an important part of that discussion.
Yeah, if we've got time for one last question, it looks like someone was curious about doing some preliminary site work. So with the Will Vasquez, the DWR search tool that's currently available, will that be updated to include the species that would be covered by this permit, so that there can be some preliminary site planning?
Yes, yes, absolutely. I mean, that is one of our most valuable tools in helping the potentially regulated communities have easy access to information so that we can all be working from the same sets of data. So that is part of, again, our planning process. Should the board elect to adopt this as final at its meeting later this month, that would be exactly one of the things we would start working on with our internal team of wildlife information managers.
Thank you. And before Laura closes us out for the day, just a housekeeping note. This recording should automatically send itself to all attendees. And with that, I look forward to Laura sending us off.
Well, again, thank you so much, Becky. This has been extremely informative. You, most of the time we have 2 speakers on this slot and you just rolled it. I appreciate you sticking in and answered some pretty difficult questions and everything. So I really appreciate it. The next one is next Wednesday, and same time, 12 o'clock. And until then, everybody be safe. I had my first tick yesterday, so be safe. They're out there, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.